Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this lecture. I'd like to welcome Professor Tufan Buzpinar, who will be lecturing today on Abdulhamid II and the Arabs. This is not part of Erdogan's neo-Ottomanism or anything. It's rather part of an exhibition that the Center for Arts and Humanities is organizing on the Hejaz Railway and the Nimr Foundation for Arts and Culture. The exhibition goes on from yesterday until June 2nd. You are all invited to go and see it. It is an interesting exhibition. Of course, Abdulhamid merits a lecture on his own, but I had to explain that this is the context of organizing this lecture because Abdulhamid was the sponsor of the Hejaz Railway, as I'm sure you all know. I take this opportunity to welcome Professor Tufan Buzpinar to the center, to AUB, and to Beirut. Many of you know Professor Buzpinar. To those who don't know him, Professor Buzpinar received his PhD from the University of Manchester in 1991. He worked subsequently in the Center for Islamic Studies, known as ISAM, in Istanbul. This is a major research center there. He was the head of the research unit at the center, and subsequently he became the director of the same center. He also served for 4 years as the member of the board of the Council of Higher Education, YÖK in Turkish, which used to be at some point the terror of Turkish academics. He also was one of the editors of Islam Encyclopediacy, which is the Encyclopedia of Islam, the Turkish Encyclopedia of Islam. He also contributed a number of articles to it. His major fields of research is the Hamidian period and Turkish-Arab relations. He has published extensively, and one of his, I'll mention just a few of his publications. He has a book on the Caliphate and the Sultanate, Caliphate and the Arabs during the reign of Abdulhamid II. This is a book which is in Turkish and is being translated, has been in translation and update for some time now. He has published also numerous articles in English on constitutionalism, on the vying for power and influence in the Hejaz, Ottoman rule in the last emirate of Abdul Muttalib and the British. He also published on the question of Jewish immigration, and at present his new research project on Christian Zionism, which will be the subject of his later lecture today at the Issam Faris Institute at 5. In retrospect, it was fortunate that we scheduled the lecture also today, since tomorrow proved to be a holiday in preparation for our great elections. Please join me in welcoming Professor Buzpinar.
Thank you. I'm honored to be among you and give a talk on Abdulhamid II and the Arabs on the occasion of the Hejaz Railway exhibition. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank and express my special gratitude to Professor Abu Hussein and for his kind invitation. Actually, in fact, it was for his sake that during our extremely busy time, I accepted this invitation and I am here with you. And I also would like to thank the Center for Arts and Humanities and those who contributed to the Hejaz Railway exhibition and organization of this lecture, Mehmet Ali Bey, Rania, and Rita, all those who contributed to this event. And secondly, I would like to explain the title of my lecture. Since the subject is too broad, Abdulhamid II and the Arabs, to cover in a lecture, I tried to focus on the region which might be called Bilad Sham, Syria, Palestine, and the Hejaz developments mainly took in this area, and try to share some of my general observations on the subject. So Professor Abu Hussein gave me 40 for 50 minutes. That means I have to finish by 3:30 now. I am starting 22, if you allow me. But I'll try to finish early, and then we can have some discussions. This man, Abdulhamid II, became the Sultan in 1876 in the middle of the crisis of the 1870s, which I will not explain. Actually, in May 1876, he was third in line to the throne. His uncle Abdulaziz was the Sultan. He was deposed at the end of May, and his elder brother Murad became the Sultan. As you know, the Ottoman rule was from the 17th century onwards. The eldest male member of the dynasty will become the Sultan. So that's why he was third in line in May, at the end of May actually. But on the 31st of August, 1876, he became the Sultan, unexpectedly, because of the crisis. So in a way, he was not preparing himself, and he was not in command of the developments at the time. And in December 1876, in a way forced to accept a new constitution because of young Ottomans and their demand for a new constitution to solve the crisis. And on December 26, 1876, as you know, Kanun Esasi, a new constitution established. And in April 1877, Russia declared war on the Ottomans. So the result of this war was a heavy defeat, and probably heaviest in Ottoman history until then. Consider all the wars that the Ottomans, even the ones lost in the 17th and 18th centuries, but this one was the heaviest the Ottomans lost in their history. And they lost over 6 million population and over 230,000 square kilometers land. After entering the war, surprisingly, it was for Abdulhamid and for all concerned, he was in a desperate search of solution to the crisis, and the war was still going on. His caliphate became the subject of intensive debate in Britain in 1877. It seems that three important developments triggered this debate. The first was that for the first time in Ottoman history, constitution mentioned the name caliph, and the caliphate, institution of caliphate, became constitutional now. The second, the Ottomans tried to use the institution of the caliphate to gain support of the Muslims during the war. And the third, enthusiastic support displayed especially by the Indian Muslims for the Ottoman Sultan Caliph during the Ottoman-Russian War. So for these reasons, there was a lively discussion on the Ottoman Caliphate, and opinions were divided between whether the Ottoman sultans had any right to assume the caliphate, whether it was now time to transfer it to the Arabs. The opponents of the Ottoman Caliphate were almost exclusively retired civil servants of the British government in India. Because of their experience in India, they feared that this link and strong support of the Indian Muslims to the Ottoman Caliphate might cause problems for the British. So British opponents rejected Ottoman Caliphate on the ground that the Caliphate belonged to the tribe of CAH. So here you have another important discussion. More importantly, it was suggested that the caliphs should be elected from among the Sharifs of Mecca simply because they were members of the CAH. And there are other discussions because of lack of time I'm not concentrating on now, but if you like, we can discuss later on. As for Syria and the impact of the war on this region. Right, let me start with the developments in Syria. Right after the war, the first governor of Syria was Cevdet Pasha. The first photograph was during the 1870s, and this was from the 1890s. This is a new one, actually discovered in Japan, and we are now using for the last few years. And apparently it was sent as a present with this Ertuğrul Fırkateyn, right, to Japan. And this man was the governor of Syria, and Cevdet Pasha was a well-known and one of the few important experts on the Arabs. He was an official historian between 1853 and 64, and during that time he wrote Tarihi Cevdet, 12 volumes, in which you have important sections on the history of the Arabs. And towards the end of his career, he wrote another important book, Kısas-ı Enbiya and Tevarihi Hulefa, again giving important sections of Islamic history. More, Cevdet Pasha was the governor of Aleppo during the 1860s, and now he was the governor of Syria in 1878. In other words, Cevdet Pasha was an important person who knew the region and the culture and appointed to Syria to try to solve the problems there. Cevdet Pasha had serious problems caused by the war. Soon after he arrived, he faced a demonstration of women, for instance, chiefly the families of departed soldiers. Syria contributed to the war enormously, and protesting against a rise in the price of bread. In addition, he had to deal with the question of refugees. The war caused hundreds of thousands of refugees, mainly from the Balkans, and it was estimated that it was more than 200,000. And in 1878, over 20,000 of them were received in Syria. So you can guess the burden on this population and at the end of the war. And more disturbing developments were to come. After a while, Arabic and Turkish placards appeared in Damascus, criticizing Cevdet Pasha and criticizing Ottoman government and their policies. In the autumn of 1878, rumors about possible annexation to Egypt was in the circulation, and news of rumors and placards together with some other complaints. Although Cevdet Pasha was a right person in the region, he was recalled because it appeared that he was not in control of the province. The next governor was Mithat Pasha. Mithat Pasha was ex-Sadrazam. He was famous while, as you know, in the 19th century, and he was hoped that he would at least restore state authority in the region. But during Mithat Pasha, disaffection and disturbances continued, and similar placards appeared in Beirut, Damascus, Saida, Tripoli, and especially the ones in Beirut and Damascus alarmed the authorities in Istanbul. And again, although Mithat Pasha, in paper, he was an able man, but again, he was not in control of the province. So he was recalled, And this time, another ex-Sadrazam, Grand Vizier, Hamdi Pasha, was chosen to end the disturbances in Syria, and Beirut was part of Syria province, as you know, at the time. Hamdi Pasha seemed fully aware of Abdulhamid's concerns. It may be assumed that the central government regarded Hamdi Pasha's task as twofold. First, to end disorder and discontent in the vilayet, and second, to consolidate the Sultan Caliph's influence and authority over all the Syrians, and in particular over the Muslims. In other words, he was to repair the damage caused by the war, and therefore Hamdi Pasha had to deal with sedition that Mithat Pasha could not solve. Unlike his predecessors, Cevdet Pasha and Mithat Pasha, Hamdi Pasha acted immediately and with determination to identify the authors of the placards and take necessary measures to end disturbances in the region. Several arrests were made and they were taken to the court, and several speculations were made about the end of disturbances, but I incline to take the view that Hamdi Pasha's measures were influential in restoring the government's authority, and this, in return, removed anxieties of the Syrian people as to the survival of Ottoman Empire and discouraged those who were hoping to weaken the Ottoman authority in the region. There were other stories, as you know, that Syrians were very anxious. They came together and tried to answer the question, what would happen if a foreign power will come and try to annex or occupy the region? It must be mentioned that Hamdi Pasha closely cooperated with the local dignitaries in restoring law and order. His response was not confined to police measures against those who believed to be responsible. He also tried to rally Syrian opinion against the placards and in favor of loyalty to the Ottoman government. He encouraged and perhaps organized a press campaign in Arabic newspapers, Syria, for instance, Asrul Jadid in Damascus, Al-Misbah Al-Jannah in Beirut, and these newspapers published articles condemning the placards and their authors as insane, ignorant, and thoughtless, and made strong appeals for the arrest and punishment of those responsible, whose activities threatened to blacken the name of the Arabs. This action, this notion of the dignity of the Arabs was particularly stressed by the Arab authors. Moreover, dignitaries in Beirut and Damascus came together and sent letters of loyalty to the Caliphate and the Sultanate. And this was from Beirut. In Ottoman Turkish, it's called Mahsar. Those dignitaries came together. Actually, you can, if you know some of the names, identify and work on this. 37 of the Beirut notables, and it's in Arabic, by the way. Only the title is in Turkish, Devletli, İbhetli, Efendim Hazretleri, and then you read in Arabic, right? You can follow. And you have the names here, 37 local dignitaries from this city. And the second, from Damascus, this was interesting. It was signed by 99 dignitaries. I think the number 99 is not coincidence. You can see, probably you know some of the names, but still we don't have time to go in detail. But I can share these documents with anyone who is interested. Right, so these were the developments or the war's negative impact on Syria and Beirut. Now let me say a few words on the Palestine developments. It appears that the crisis in the Balkans and subsequent heavy defeat of the Ottomans encouraged some people in England to organize new Jewish settlements in Palestine. Many people believed that the needy of Ottoman Empire the Ottoman Empire in need, would surrender Palestine in return for cash, for money. There were several names. I will mention one, Goldwin Smith, and then Edward Cazalet, and then Charles Warren. All these, they prepared some proposals, but Warren, for instance, argued that taking advantage of the weak position of the Ottoman Empire, the wealthy Jews should establish a firm similar to the East India Company, you know that company working for the British government. That company would purchase extensive lands in Palestine in return for substantial payments to the Ottoman government. In addition, it would undertake the responsibility of paying interest that the Ottoman government owed to the European creditors, referring to Ottoman debt that they started borrowing from foreign countries in 1854 and in 1875 announced bankruptcy, right? More interesting and more detailed a plan was prepared by a British restorationist, or to use modern term, Christian Zionist, Lawrence Oliphant. Oliphant died in 1888. He was born in 1829. Oliphant was too motivated by the heavy defeat of the Ottomans. In 1878, he began working on the question of Jewish settlement in Palestine. He shared his views about it with the Prime Minister Disraeli and Foreign Secretary Salisbury, and they encouraged him, go and do whatever you want. And in early 1879, he came to this city and helped by the Consular Eldridge and went to Palestine and toured Palestine and identified a land, and in the end, in May 1879, went to Istanbul, prepared a detailed proposal and submitted to the Ottoman government in June 1879. This was the first and the only proposal. We have documents in Ottoman archives, and the first and the only one discussed by the Ottoman government. We have official translation in Ottoman Turkish. It had 37 articles altogether, and it proposed establishment of a company called the Ottoman Company for Settlement of Migrants in Palestine. The company would purchase 1 million acre state land between River Jordan and the Hajj route to Mecca in Belka, with the right to use its underground and overground resources. It would be the company responsible for the settlement and administration of the Jewish migrants, as well as preservation of law and order in the area. And, not surprisingly, Oliphant's plan also included substantial amount of payment to the Ottoman government. It's interesting that in British circles during this time, many people thought that for cash, the Ottomans would sell land in Palestine. I don't know why they thought so, but you see in many small treaties and writings, and I've seen many in British late 19th century publications. Initially, the government did not respond. Oliphant stayed, by the way, in Istanbul for a year, either because they didn't take it seriously or because they were extremely busy with the serious crisis. But the British ambassador to Istanbul, Layard, he insisted on the Sultan that he should say something on this. This man, actually, Lawrence Oliphant. And at the end, we will discuss this in the afternoon session in detail, but the conclusion, the government, the Ottoman government, refused the proposal and said it meant government within a government. And this concept, actually, in Layard's report to the Foreign Office, Layard used state within a state. What Oliphant proposed to the Ottoman government, seen by the Ottoman government as government within a government or state within a state. And they said, although the region needs better relations or Ottoman investment, but now it was not acceptable. Pressed by the British and American ambassadors as to the needs of settlement of thousands of Jews. By the way, in Istanbul, in the streets, there were so many Jews as well from the Balkans, because the Russians, during 1879 and 80, punished many Jews in Romania and Russia, and many of them migrated to Istanbul and were in search of new territories. The Ottoman authorities responded that the needy Jews were allowed to settle in Rumelia and in Anatolia, but not in Palestine and in surrounding areas, including Syria, right, and Beirut. Those who accept the Ottoman offer could be settled in territories in Anatolia and Rumelia. The Ottoman government will show them the territories and responsible for to the government. Now, a few words about the war's impact on the Hejaz. The Ottoman government, as you know, operated a unique system of dual authority in the Hejaz. Like other provinces, the Hejaz had a wali, governor, who served as the Sultan's representative. But at the same time, there was Emir of Mecca, who was responsible, whose actually responsibilities and powers were not defined, but assumed that he was responsible for the Mecca only, the city. By the end of 1877, Mecca was effectively under the control of Emir Hussein Pasha, grandfather of the one who revolted in 1916. The Emir soon showed himself to be an extremely clever and ambitious man who dared to pursue a bold but delicate policy in the Hejaz, while outwardly presenting himself as a loyal Emir who protected Ottoman interests. Hussein Pasha secretly worked to undermine Ottoman authority by spreading anti-Ottoman views and by collaborating with the foreign representatives, chiefly with the British. In March 1879, after less than 2 weeks, the first professional consul of British government took office in Jeddah. Emir Hussein Pasha offered to act as intermediary between the Afghan Muslims and the British. Hussein Pasha's timing was not right, because Afghan Emir died earlier in 1879, and the British government was about to peacefully resolve its differences with the new Emir, Yaqub Khan. However, the British authorities appreciated Hussein Pasha's offer and foresaw that his cooperation might prove valuable in the future. It was the outbreak of a second Anglo-Afghan War in early September 1879, which prompted the Emir to renew contact with the British consul in Jeddah. He sent a message reiterating his readiness to help the British cause whenever and wherever it might be needed. Under any circumstances, this is a quote from Sharif Hussein's writings, England may depend on me to do all in my power to further her wishes. After long discussions and correspondence with different departments, including India office, the British government accepted the Emir's offer. Zohrab was given the authority to arrange with the Emir to send the proposed agents to India, and those agents would go on his name and say that Britain is your friend. You should not fight against Britain, advising the Muslims in Afghanistan and India. That was the idea. Because Sharif argued that because he's a noble descendant and member of CAH, his word would be influential, not the Sultan Caliphs in Istanbul. They worked out details, and preparations were about to be finalized when Emir, when he was entering Jeddah, he was assassinated by an Afghan. Interestingly, we could not solve why he was assassinated by an Afghan on 14 March 1880. There is no reason to believe that Hussein Pasha's secret disloyalty to the Ottoman state and his attempts to cultivate the British were grounded in particular grievances against Ottoman rule in the Hejaz. As already indicated, his relations with the Ottoman government were good, and he was permitted and even encouraged to exercise a considerable local authority. Rather, the grounds for his disloyalty appear to have been in part personal ambition, but also a belief not uncommon among the senior Ottoman functionaries at the time that the Ottoman Empire's prospect of survival were questionable. In other words, many people in Syria, in Palestine, in Hejaz, during the years between 1877 and 82 were questioning whether the Ottoman Empire will be able to survive, right? So in short, from the foregoing details, it can be deduced that the war with Russia had seriously damaged Ottoman image and authority in the eyes of many people living in Syria, Palestine, and the Hejaz. Against this background, Abdulhamid had to make serious assessments to decide how to rule the empire. The conclusions he drew from these crises were decisive in shaping his policies and regime. In the first place, it was plain to him that Ottomanism of the Tanzimat period was bankrupt. It had to be reviewed, and it did not solve the problems in the Balkans. Abdulhamid drew the conclusion that the Ottoman state's most fundamental problem was unity, and he could see no other practical basis for unity but Islam. Muslims had constituted now, with the loss of over 6 million, an absolute majority of the population, and that majority now was much increased thanks to the losses. This is a quotation from his sayings. The priority of the subjects who constitute a majority over the rest is an unavoidable necessity in any state. The religion of the sublime state of the Ottomans is the religion of Islam, and the Muslims are in majority among its subjects. Therefore, Muslims from then on deserve priority. But equally important, Abdulhamid was convinced that religion was everywhere a powerful force for unity and solidarity. He often argued that it was Christianity that formed the basis of political and social solidarity in the European countries, and that it was above all the religious bond that led the European countries to intervene on behalf of the Ottoman Christians. He even went so far as to suggest that there existed an undeclared unity based on common religion among the European great powers against the Muslim Ottoman state. In other words, his emphasis on Islam and Muslims was a kind of defensive response to the great power politics of the time. If religion was the basis of unity and solidarity, it was the basis of obedience and loyalty. Here, the traditional Ottoman claim to the Caliphate offered Abdulhamid a means of appealing directly to his Muslim subjects' religious allegiance. They referred, as the Sultan is the Caliph of Islam, to be in his service means to be in the service of all Muslims. Islam was the political force which would support the Ottoman state. The Caliphate, in the person of Abdulhamid, was the focus upon which that force would be concentrated. Indeed, unconditional obedience was the main theme of many newspaper articles, pamphlets, and books published during Abdulhamid II's reign. The Quranic verse, here I quote, "Obey God, his prophet, and those entrusted with authority among you," was commonly cited to support the argument that the Sultan Caliph must be obeyed under all circumstances and conditions. Abdulhamid supported in this view by leading men like Ahmet Cevdet Pasha, we mentioned, Hayrettin Pasha el-Tunisi, remember his name, and other ministers. And actually, Cevdet Pasha, in terms of his policies of this region, was very influential, and Akarlı thinks that it was Cevdet Pasha who, in a way, formulated Abdulhamid's Arab policies. And let me quote a small paragraph from Cevdet Pasha. "The sublime state is a large body composed of various peoples Aqwam, and classes Sunuf, which cohere by the sacred power of the Caliphate. Islam provides the Arab, Kurd, Albanian, Bosnian with a sense of direction. And that's why he said it was necessary to hold in high esteem the Arabs, because their language is the language of our religion, and along with the Arabs, we have to take care of other peoples because they are equals of the Arabs and Turks. This was the basic arrangement, this is a quotation made by Yavuz Sultan Selim, who took all these regions under Ottoman rule. So you know that during Abdulhamid's time, public religiosity was apparent, and he was himself was very keen on that, and he thought that prayers or ibadat had two meanings. One is personal, and the other one is political. And personal one, I'm not going to spare any time, but the political one, I have a secret order sent to Egypt. I'll quote from this. He says, members of the delegation sent to Egypt after the occupation of Egypt in 1882 by the British, they should say prayers on time, even if they do not do so here in Istanbul, and fast during the Ramadan, even if they do not fast in their own private life. If for any reason they cannot fast, they should not reveal it and should visit mosques, tombs, and historical places. This, in a way, he was saying that Abdulhamid emphasized officials' public appearance, that it should fit with the state policies. Time is running fast, and let me... the other important aspect of Abdulhamid's second period, emphasis on Islam, was the field of education. His reign witnessed an unprecedented expansion of state education, and schools, secondary schools, high schools, and others opened in actually thousands in the province of Syria and Beirut and in Arab provinces. And many of them encouraged the Arabs graduate of these schools to go to Istanbul to continue their education in the Mülkiye or civil administration school, the School of Law and Medical School, and finally in 1900, as you know, there was the University of Istanbul. And a PhD thesis finished at the University of Princeton proved that all Arab graduates of School of Civil Administration were employed. You can check Corinne Blake's thesis on the Arabs who went to Istanbul and high schools, civil military schools and military medical schools and Mülkiye, they were all employed. The last one in the field of education I should mention is, as you know, the Ashiret Mektebi, which was found in 1892, and until 1907 it was open in Istanbul, addressed the children of tribes, mainly in Arab provinces, but later on it was extended to other areas. And the principal idea of this to try to integrate Arab tribes into the Ottoman system through their children, right? Now, as for Abdulhamid's attitude towards his Arab subjects, the prevailing view is that Abdulhamid gathered influential Arabs around him and established official and unofficial ties with the Arab notables. I mentioned some names, but some others, Sadiq and Shafiq al-Muayyad from Syria, Abdullah Bey, again from Syria, Muhammad and Muhyiddin Jazairis from Damascus, Jazairi family, Rifai Sheikh Abul Huda Sayyadi, Shazali Sheikh Muhammad Zafir, Sayyid Fazl of Hadramut, Abdul Qadir al-Qudsi from Aleppo, Izzat al-Abid from Damascus, and from this region, Melhame brothers, Selim, and sorry, I lost myself. Mines and Agriculture, Selim, yes, Necip and Selim brothers, and Abdullah Pasha Al Saud of Nejd, all were in Istanbul, right? But this is one side of the story, and here I will quote another unique document from, this is the one, actually you can see how he emphasized his titles as Sultan al-Azam, Hakan al-Azam, Amir al-Mu'mineen, Khalifatul Muslimin, as you see. This is Tulus Hayrettin Pasha, Friday ceremony I couldn't mention, and this is made by Abdulhamid, a present to Sheikh Zafir. You can see what it writes here, Re'sul Hikmah, sorry, this way. Muhabbatullah, right? Yes, this is made by Abdulhamid, by the way, in the palace. This is annual ceremony from, let me show you a letter by right, this is the letter. You can, I'll quote in English and have a look. This is Abul Huda's handwriting, by the way. He says, "My benefactor, Caliph of the religion and deputy of the Lord of Apostles, for the sake of your blessed head and the great religion of Islam, never again will I dress a uniform, wear decorations, and accept an official position if I am not distinguished from Izzet Bey of Damascus and put above him because of my seniority in service, my medal of distinction, and my knowledge and my truthful loyalty," right? So you see the difficulty Abdulhamid faced while having these Arabs close to him and employing them in the palace. So you know that Abdulhamid sent prestigious gifts to win Arab notables and building mosques, masjids, repairing and many, and published books. And also there were several proposals to the Sultan how to improve communication with the Arabs. For this, they offered publication of several newspapers, Vakit, Selam, and Constantiniye in Istanbul, in Arabic, in order to communicate better with the Arabs. And you know that from the 1890s onwards, you have the opposition of some Arab intellectuals, Selim Faris, Faris Shidyak's son and founder of El Jawaib, and Emin Arslan, and Abdulhamid Zehrawi, and some others, Kewakibi from Aleppo, and the second group, Salafis from Damascus. I have no time to spare on them. And in the 1890s, again, debate in Britain on the Ottoman Caliphate and try to limit its influence. At the time when he was severely criticized by some intellectuals in the Arab world and in the West, the Sultan decided on a project that enhanced his reputation as the leader of world Muslims. The Caliph, that was the decision to construct Hejaz Railway. For that we are here. Let me show you some photographs of that. Those who, by the way, this was, as you know, in Marja Square in Damascus, and this is the inscription, Amir al-Mu'mineen, Khalifa Rasul Rabbil Alameen. Again, I can share this with you if you like later on. And this is the original card postcard, early 20th century. And this is to show that I was there years ago, but I cannot go now. And this is the model, by the way. And the cost were paid by Abdulhamid. And you can see that the inscription here on the model as well. Caliphate, Sultan, Al-Bahrain, Al-Hakan. And here it says that the cost was paid by him, sorry. And this one at the top is the Yildiz Palace Mosque in Istanbul. Here at the top, right? Right, Hejaz Railway. It was called at the time Hamidiya Hejaz Railway, and it was the only railway itself that enhanced his position and put the way it was presented to the world Muslims. The level of mobilization of world Muslim opinion in support of the project itself, and indirectly in support of the Ottoman Sultan Caliph, was, I think, unprecedented. The first large donation was made by him, 50,000 lira, and the propaganda campaigns emphasized that the Hejaz Railway project did not only belong to the Ottomans, but to the world Muslims. Muslims from around the world, including Britain, France, the United States, and colonies of the British, French, and Russia, they all contributed, right? And from this project, there were 8 native proposals, by the way. I have the list of it, if you're interested. And Abdulhamid decided, after a proposal made by the Ottoman High Commissioner in Cairo, but we do not know exactly which one was decisive on his mind, right? But at least we have 8 native proposals. And you know its religious importance. And from 1879 onwards, there was a discussion of changing the route from Damascus to Mecca and Medina, and using sea route, right? Mithat Pasha first argued that it was easier for the Ottomans and cheaper to organize the Hajj route from Beirut to Jeddah and then to Mecca. But Abdulhamid rejected Mithat Pasha's proposal, saying that no, the traditional route should be preserved. It was very important for the Ottomans to bring the Muslim pilgrims in Damascus. Damascus was a meeting point, actually. Several times they offered Abdulhamid to change the route, but he said no. And as you know, this Hejaz Railway route is on that traditional Hajj route from Damascus to, because he thought that it was an opportunity for the people of the region for many reasons, for religious reasons, for commercial reasons, for cultural reasons, for economic reasons, right? People used to wait for that season to sell their goods, etc. So I'm going to limit my observations on Hejaz Railway because of lack of time. But let me say one word and then come to the conclusion that some foreign engineers worked for the construction until halfway through, and from then on, Ottomans employed all Muslim engineers. So this was the first and the only project where Muslim engineers, at least for the last part of the railway, worked for the construction. In conclusion, let me say my observations on the Abdulhamid II and the Arabs. It's fair to say that Abdulhamid II held the view that for the future of the state and the Ottoman Caliphate, it was essential to keep Arab provinces under Ottoman rule, and that employment of educated Arabs in the government offices was one of the important means to integrate the Arabs into the Ottoman system. Right from the beginning of his reign, the Sultan realized the importance of establishing sound relations with the Arab subjects of the state. First few years, he tried hard to establish state authority in the Arab provinces and restore the state's image, which was highly damaged by the disastrous war. It's fair to say that by 1882, he made tremendous progress in this direction. It is interesting to note that the British occupation of Egypt in 1882 strengthened Ottomanization tendencies among the Muslim Arab dignitaries, not only in Syria and Palestine, but in Egypt as well. Jankowski's studies made it clear that, here I quote from him, the expression of loyalty to the Ottoman Empire was one of the few ways, however feeble, for Egyptians to oppose the British in a legal, legitimate fashion between 1882 and 1914, and it became a method of protecting oneself against the imperialist assault of the British. My own studies on Syria after the occupation of Egypt indicate similar developments among the leading Syrians. It increased solidarity, enhanced Ottomanism, and produced a strong reaction against the British. In fact, similar developments took place in the case of the Algerian immigrants in Syria. After Abdulkadir al-Jazairi died in 1883, there was a strong rivalry between France and the Ottoman Empire over the citizenship question of the Algerians. And by the end of the century, all Algerians except for Hashim, who opted for the French citizenship, became Ottomanized and accepted Ottoman citizenship. As for the Caliphate, it soon became clear that using the Caliphate as an effective instrument had both advantages and disadvantages. While his supporters tried to justify their loyalty and obedience to him by reference to the Caliphate, the opposition groups tried to weaken his position by questioning the legitimacy of his claim to the Caliphate. The supporters' efforts to justify the Ottoman Caliphate were apparently not enough to comfort Abdulhamid II. Throughout his reign, his mind was always occupied with the opposition to his Caliphate. As mentioned, the British involvement in the debates on the issue of an Arab Caliphate, together with the increasing British influence in this region, led Abdulhamid II to have misgivings about British plans for the Ottoman Arabs. As he himself explained to journalist Ahmet Mithat Efendi, here I quote, England's aim is to transfer the Great Caliphate from Istanbul to Jeddah in Arabia or to a place in Egypt by keeping the Caliphate under her control to manage all the Muslims as he wishes. Although people like Cevdet Pasha, Sheikh Ebul Huda tried to convince the Sultan that the Arabs were well aware of their responsibility of obedience to the Caliph and as such would always uphold the Caliph's authority in Arab provinces, Abdulhamid's fear of a possible Arab pretender to the Caliphate prevailed throughout his reign. Periodic secret instructions were sent to the governors of Aleppo, Baghdad, Beirut, Syria, the Hejaz, and Yemen, asking them to be vigilant in order to preempt British and Egyptian seditious efforts that were aimed at separating the sacred Islamic Caliphate from the Ottoman Sultanate. How successful Abdulhamid II was in influencing Arab public opinion about the Ottoman state and the Caliphate is difficult to know. However, there are two incidents which may be cited to indicate the degree of Abdulhamid's influence on the Arabs and Arab lands. The first one being during the first years of his reign, the second during the last. In the first incident, Wilfred Blunt, one of the British diplomats looking for a way to separate the Arabs from the Ottoman state, actually he was here for 3 years between 79 to 82 and been to Beirut, Damascus, Cairo, and visited several Arab leaders to, in a way, organize them against the Ottomans. By 1882, he came to the conclusion that Abdulhamid had established the authority of the state and then the Arabs had begun to trust him. From this, Blunt reached the conclusion that it would be impossible to remove the Arabs from the Ottoman state during Abdulhamid II's reign and gave up his activities against the Ottomans and retired to London in 1882. The second example indicates that the Sultan's claim to the Caliphate, as well received by the Muslim Arabs in 1909, after the revolution of Young Turks, but before the Sultan was deposed, Hashim Bey, a school headmaster in Latakia here, and a strong supporter of the Young Turks, asked his students to read poems. The next day, one of the students read a poem praising Abdulhamid II. Hashim Bey became very angry and took the paper from student's hand, ripped it up, and threw it to the ground. The student told the story to his father, and his father informed his neighbors. Then a Muslim crowd gathered in the Maghribi Mosque to punish the headmaster, who insulted Caliphate Muslimin and Amir al-Mu'mineen. However, Hashim Bey's life was saved by the great efforts of the Mutasarrif, a famous Turkish governor, Mehmet Ali Ayni. He wrote this actual story in his memoirs, who secretly boarded him on an Italian ship and saved his life in 1909. Thank you so much, and I finished on time, Professor.
Thank you very much, Professor Buzpinar, for this very interesting talk. And thank you for being very punctual too. And we open the floor for questions, comments, if there are any.
Actually, we can show these photographs on Hejaz Railway, and there's one interesting, those who couldn't visit the, and this is a station in Medina, by the way. This is a new one. And you can see a mosque, Ottoman Mosque, and this is another view of Medina Station, the last station in Medina. And this is the mosque built by Abdulhamid II in honor of this Hejaz Railway. But these are the new, I think taken a few years ago in Medina Hejaz Railway Station. Sorry.
Karim Kubaylat, founding member of Lebanon Readers Society. So I wanted to ask regarding the Prussian alliance with the Ottoman during Abdulhamid time. Do you think doing expedition of German Orientalists in the Levant regarding Islamic heritage, like old Islamic history, was a way of Abdulhamid to stronger the bond with the Arabs, and in a way also to have a kind of a challenge against the English, against the British, their alliance with the Prussians.
Prussians?
Yes.
The Germans, right.
Yeah, Germans.
Okay. Right. Abdulhamid II's relations with the Germans, you mean, was it against the British in the region?
It is a way to bond with the Arabs, letting the German Orientalists to dig more into the Islamic history, and in another way also to face the British imperialism. I'm asking.
Right. I think, as you know, Abdulhamid tried to improve Ottoman-German relations from May 1880 onwards. After, in a way, clearing his mind that the British, as I just mentioned, some of his arguments, he thought that the British decided, not openly but secretly, to give up supporting the Ottomans against the Russians and against other powers. And although he did not wish to break relations with the British, but tried to balance Ottoman relations with another great power. And that was, there was only one option, and that was Germany, after the unification of Germany and defeat of France. But there, if you look at Ottoman-German relations from 1880 onwards, he tried to have a kind of limited relation, limited to military relations and economic. and try to avoid.
So to social science too, right?
Yes.
Academic research too.
But he always tried to avoid confrontation with the British and tried to limit his relations with Germany in a level that will not cause a confrontation, right? And in the final analysis, he strongly believed that he should avoid a war with the British by all costs. And that's why I think, in a way, limited German influence in the Ottoman Empire, but the Germans from 1890s onwards, as you know, wished to have more and more in the Ottoman territories, counterbalance the French and the British influence. And how far, they managed, the Ottomans and the Germans, and the British, of course, were very angry. And that's why they thought that all these collaborations and influence on the Arabs were against the British. This time they thought that it was all designed to curb the British influence in this region. So both sides mistrusted, I think, each other from the 1880s onwards.
Quick comment and a question. The first comment is that the two Faramans that were signed for the two oldest universities in Beirut were actually signed by Abdulhamid. So we have a very particular relationship with that Sultan. The question is, how much was he able or was he willing to keep the Ottoman Empire outside World War I? This is important because that time, that specific era determined the rest of our history as Arabs. And sometimes you go into the exercise of what if the Ottoman Empire had remained neutral, and we got into this. What can you tell us about
Difficult question. My own inclination is that the Ottomans, even if they wished to stay out of the war, were not able to because of the rivalry started during the 1870s at the latest, right? We can go back to 1840s, 50s, and the war with Russia, etc. But especially from the 1870s onwards, and particularly with the German-Ottoman rapprochement and polarization of world politics and arms deals of the 1890s and 1900s, I think the Ottomans lost the chance by 1904 and onwards, when British and the French at least came together, right, signed an agreement, and by 1907 they signed an agreement with Russia. And I think these three powers determined to end the Ottoman Empire, if possible. Abdulhamid, in his memoirs, said that if he was in power, he wouldn't have let the Ottoman Empire enter the war. But I think it's not that easy to answer. I asked one of my friends who is using German sources as well as Ottoman, British, and French sources on this period, whether it was possible for the Ottomans to stay out of the war. Gül Tokay, she has published extensively on this period. She says the chance was there, but it was very slim. If we remember, the Young Turks, after 1909, tried to develop relations with the French and the British. Both sides did not respond positively to the Young Turk approach to these two powers, and they said it was Abdulhamid who caused these bad relations between these powers. We are different, young Turks. We deposed him. We are in power now. Let's improve Ottoman relations with the French and with the British. But both powers did not give any room to the young Turks. My own inclination is still, it was almost impossible for the Ottomans to stay out of the war because of the geography, right? Because of the location in the Balkans, in the Middle East and Anatolia, and because of the Russian determination since the second half of the 18th century, since Katerina II, that to expand at the expense of the Ottomans, right? It was an important chance for the Russians to use the First World War to expand.
Thank you, Tufan Hoca. I have two questions. One, I was wondering whether you could tell us a little bit more about the Ottoman, Abdulhamid and the Ottoman government's reaction to the British invasion of Egypt in 1882. And secondly, I was wondering whether you could also tell us what you sense from the archival documents and the chronicles of the time, what you sense was meant by the Arabs in these documents. Did it have is it a linguistic category, or is it the inhabitants of Bilad al-Sham, basically? Or is it a more expansive category that includes what we now today imagine as the Arab world?
Right. The first question, Abdulhamid II found the Egyptian crisis on the table when he became the Sultan, as you know. Ismail Pasha, his extravagant policies and his relations with the British and the French. When he was asked to depose Ismail Pasha, he did not accept first. But Hayrettin Pasha al-Tunisi convinced him that there was no other way, that Ismail Pasha bankrupted the government of Egypt, and British and French, they were very strong, and the Ottoman Empire now, right after the war, was very weak. So you had to depose him. After the deposition and crisis in Egypt, Abdulhamid was very worried, of course. He read that the Urabi Pasha movement in Egypt was a kind of signs of Arab nationalism, because Egypt for Egyptians and Egyptians, this was the first time in the Arab provinces that now, together with the placards in Beirut, Damascus, Saida, so he was very alarmed. But at the same time, he was unable to do anything, right? And when British asked him to go together and solve the problem, he did not accept, because he remembered from Islamic history that first years of Hazrat Ali and Muawiyah, he thought that Egyptian soldiers, they are Muslims, and my soldiers, they are Muslims. They would use Quran against, and my soldiers could not fight against them. This is a trick. So he tried to stay out of the crisis. And after the occupation, in a way, he was actually, this was his foreign policy, right from the beginning till the end. He tried to avoid war with any great power. If not possible, he accepted the result. The occupation of Tunis in 1881 was the same, right? The occupation of Egypt in 1882 was another example. But he tried to use this to strengthen his power and his influence over other provinces, and also to safeguard other provinces, especially Hejaz, Yemen, and Palestine. And now we know that from studies by Jankowski and others, Deringil, Abdulhamid's policy for Egypt actually worked quite well for him, because reactions in this part was against the British was very strong. And it pleased him, but at the same time, he had to control the reaction here because he couldn't face a war with Britain. So there was a censor between Egypt and Beirut, Damascus, Palestine. News cut because of the strong public reaction, right? So in a way, the occupation of Egypt indirectly increased his popularity in these areas. Ottomanism and solidarity, pan-Islamism within Ottoman Empire in a sense, because a great power is occupying a Muslim territory, the rest come together and unite. But at the same time, he was always anxious that the British, by using their base in Cairo, were trying to change the minds of some intellectual Arabs, right? They were using Cairo as a basis of anti-Ottoman intrigues. And that was the main. And my article on Syria, for instance, repercussions of the British occupation of Egypt, interesting stories. And he asked leading members of the Egyptians who migrated to this part, leave Damascus and Beirut, because he thought that those members were influenced by Urabi movement. And in return, they would influence the people in this region ideologically. And ideology, for someone, in the Ottoman Empire, and especially national ideology, very dangerous and destructive. Now, for this first part, for the second, for the Arabs, if you can say your question again.
Just if you have, what was meant, so in a document, if there's the word Arabs.
Oh, the Arabs in Ottoman documents, right.
What do you have a sense of what was meant by that explicitly, or what the cultural, the geocultural imagination involved? Just a little bit, if you have.
Well, first of all, it's a very difficult question. I mean, as you know, the spirit of age, the age you live in and we are living in, and the people living in the late 19th century and early 20th century, from Abdulhamid's point of view and from the traditional leaders and conservatives like Cevdet Pasha and Tunuslu Hayrettin Pasha and others, they saw that, if they respect Arabs and treat them well when they come to Istanbul or in their provinces. By the way, for instance, the Constitution declared that the official language of the empire was Turkish, 1876 Constitution. But during Abdulhamid's second period, Turkish was not forced in Arab provinces. Instead, people used Arabic in the courts, in schools, in wherever, and they had translators, and sometimes they did not have, some officials knew. And in any case, Turkish officials, the number of Turkish officials limited anyway. And Abdulhamid wanted to improve connections and, in a way, the relations with the Arabs by publications, by receiving them at the palace, and we have several instances of Arab delegates coming from different parts, and responding their letters. I've seen several letters, for instance, I saw you in my dream and you were such and such and this and that, and they were responded politely, right? So trying to establish on traditional basis, Abdulhamid tried to do almost everything that he was advised to do, right? And Cevdet Pasha says, for instance, yes, during the Tanzimat period, the Arabs, some of the Arabs and some of the Turkish officials in Arab provinces did not act properly. So we should correct, he says. We should respect these people, that at least, their language is the language of our religion. And after the loss of the Balkans, by the way, rationally for the Ottomans, keeping the Arab provinces under Ottoman control became more important than ever, right? In a way, it became a kind of Turkish Arab empire since the loss of the Balkan provinces. So that, in a way, forced Abdulhamid and his officials to, and sometimes, as I know, we have so many questions. I could mention, for instance, from 1886 onwards, Arab provinces listed first in the official yearbooks or salnames. And that meant, of course, right to the end of the Abdulhamid II period, by the way, it was so. And that meant, of course, appointments to the Arab provinces and payments to the officials in the Arab provinces. But we do not have any specific study focusing on post-1886, for instance, what happened after Arab provinces placed first in the salnames, and how for instance, the Minister of Finance arranged payments to the Arab provinces, how the military appointments and civil appointments, etc. We need more studies on these decisions and implementation of these decisions. It's not fair to conclude that, by placing Arab provinces first in the official salnames, the Arabs became first in we need something specific on these questions for us. It's good that Corinne did a PhD on Arabs at the civil Mulkiye, civil. Yes, you have the name in Mulkiye, and we know that all the graduates from Arab provinces, right after their graduation, were sent and employed by the state. And Abdulhamid himself was very keen on employing the bright ones, the ones graduated with degrees from these schools. So remember, for instance, Sati al-Husri, he was an Ottoman Arab, as you know, and raised during Abdulhamid II period, and appointed to several important posts. And in 1919, he questioned whether he was an Arab or Ottoman, because his Ottoman Turkish was better than his Arabic, by the way. And some people visited him towards the end of his life during the 1960s. He was speaking Arabic with Turkish accent. Sorry?
His son also spoke Ottoman very fluently as his first language.
So I think in terms of integration, we can see that from Down's studies, for instance, Ernest Down's Ottomanism, we can see that this process of integration and Ottomanization made improvements in relations. And considering or comparing the period that Abdulhamid took office in late 1870s and the period he left, I think Turkish-Arab relations were much better in every sense of the word.
Tufan, if I may, as a follow-up just on Ali's question, because I think he also inquired what was meant by Arab. Where Abdulhamid and his establishment, or subsequently the young Turks that followed, and were they looking at the Arab provinces as these lands of wilderness that need to be civilized, and were the Arabs sort of the subject people of an imperial power?
Oh, that question. I'm sorry.
When the term Arab was used, what what came into the minds of people like Javdet, people like Midhat Pasha, people like Abdulhamid himself?
No, I got the point. Well, as you know, the Bedouins, or the Urban, they were seen in a different category. And when the Ottoman officials, when they talked about Arabs, they never meant the Bedouins or tribes living outside the cities or civilized centers, to use the term, right? They were seen in a different category and treated differently, and these Bedouin tribes always they caused destruction of communication between Damascus and Medina, for instance, during the Hajj route. That was the most important event in this region, actually. And Abdulhamid II and all the other Ottoman officials took it very seriously, because that for the image of the Ottoman Empire, it was very important. From the 1876 onwards, even the Iranian pilgrims were coming to Damascus and then going to Medina. So all pilgrims from Central Asia, from the Balkans, Anatolia, right? As you know, there were two routes, one from Cairo and one from Damascus. And Damascus one was under complete control of the Ottoman authorities, always, and very important. And they spent months in this region. So Bedouin threat to Ottoman security in towns and cities were always serious. And that is one of the reasons why the Ottomans did not abolish the institution of emirate, actually. There is an interesting discussion among Ottoman ministers. Abdulhamid also chaired them. And they asked the question, why do we keep the sheriff in power in Mecca, right? Do we have to? The answer was no, we don't have to keep him there. There was no reason to keep emir in power in Mecca. But they said, how about the Bedouins? Urban, right? If we abolish this system, then we have to deal with the Bedouins directly ourselves, right? So for that, we needed extra troops from Anatolia. So extra troops in number, it was easy, but the climate was so different. So the Ottoman troops coming from Anatolia were not able to serve in the Hejaz because of the climatic conditions, because of desert conditions. So for practical reasons, that because emir had links with the Urban Bedouins, and through emir, by using emir's authority and its connections with the Urbans, they kept them there, right, in order to control. So in the Ottoman eyes, Urban did not mean Arabs, right? The Arabs, and unfortunately some researchers confuse this, and they translate Urban as Arab. I think that's not true. It should be translated Bedouins in English, so that, because in Ottoman document you can see that differentiation. Urban is different from the city Arabs or settled areas in this region.
Yes.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Just very quickly, I'm wondering if you could shed any light on the view of the I guess traditional centers of Islamic scholarship, particularly in Egypt and in Syria, and their discussions around the legitimacy or not of Abdulhamid's claim to the Caliphate.
Right. You mean the Salafis' view on the Ottoman Caliphate?
Not Salafis, no, people from Al-Azhar, for example, or centers of learning in Damascus, yeah.
We need to write a book on this. Actually, in the future, I'm hoping to see a monograph on this question, because this is a very important question, that how the Arabs viewed Ottoman Caliphate right from the 16th century onwards, I mean, in their original sources, right? We do not know much about Arabic sources and their views, but unfortunately, in a way, through Western sources, we know something about this question, right? I studied activities of Blunt in the late 1870s in this region, and he published a book called The Future of Islam, probably you know it. And through him, if he is saying truth about some people's thought in the early 1880s, that some Arabs questioned the legitimacy of the Ottoman Caliphate. And he says, in fact, he was made aware of this question in Cairo by one of the students of Muhammad Abduh. Otherwise, he was not aware of this question, that the question of Quraysh tribe and, legitimacy of the Ottoman Caliphate. The British, it seems that started this debate on the legitimacy of the Ottoman Caliphate, and saying that since you do not belong to the tribe of Quraysh, and al-Aimma min Quraysh, tradition, hadith is there, so how come then you claim the caliphate? But at the same time, again, some British authorities responded, and Redhouse, for instance, the famous one, James Redhouse, we all know and use his dictionary. James Redhouse responded that this was an old question, and the Muslims all over the world accepted the Ottoman Caliphate, and there were some other Arabic English lexicon writer, Birdwood, could be, and there were some other people who also defended Ottoman Caliphate. Yes, the Ottomans did not belong to the tribe of Quraysh, but that condition was valid for the first 30 years of Islamic Caliphate. They used the term Hilafet-i Kamile. After that, the caliphs always lacked some of the conditions, and the Ottomans lacked the condition of Quraysh, right? And others lacked other conditions. So the Ottoman Caliphate was legitimate. This was the first years of his reign. Interestingly, towards the end of 1890s, again, this discussion in Cairo and in London started, and the same emphasis on the Ottoman belonging not to Quraysh, but this time, for the first time in the history of this region, Kewakibi wrote a book called Qura, in which he argued that Caliphate belonged to the Arabs. So as far as we know, that is the first written statement against the Ottoman Caliphate by the Arabs. So that is either 1898 or 9. And again, as we know, that Kewakibi was with Abduh and Rashid Riza, both were in Cairo. Apparently, they gave the final shape to his book, Qura. So I personally wish to know whether Kewakibi, when he was in Aleppo, had this view, or whether when he came to Cairo, he was influenced by Abduh and Riza and put that view in his book. We do not know that part of it, but at least what we know, that these three came together and, gave final shape to his book and then published. So that was the first time an Arab, in a written statement, refused the legitimacy of Ottoman Caliphate. And after that, again, we don't have actually anything written, but again, young Turks, for instance, not the Arabs, but young Turks raised this questioned legitimacy of Abdulhamid's caliphate, not the Ottoman Caliphate this time. they said that Abdulhamid was not fit for this office. So I hope it helps you to understand the period's context.
Thank you very much, Professor.
You're welcome. I thank you for giving me this opportunity to share but questions were very essential questions.